Good afternoon, those of you who are watching on YouTube or Facebook. Mike Trzynski with you here on this 4th of July weekend. And I mentioned last week I was going to be doing a weekly teaching for you and hope you take advantage of this. Spoke about the sovereignty of God last Saturday, and today I want to talk to you about the Synoptic Gospels in contrast to the Gospel of John. I've done a lot of studying on these things, and I just wanted to share it with you and see how it sits with you. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And synoptic means to see together. The three of them, we know only really one, Matthew, was a follower of Jesus, one of the 12. And I'll break this down a little bit more. And there is a lot of differences between these three Gospels and the Gospel of John. They see things together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John is altogether different because it's written at another time, another period of, another era, if you will, in Christianity. More on that in a few minutes. But let me start with Matthew. Did you know that Matthew borrows from Mark? There's a lot of give and take here with the writings of the scriptures with these three men. Mark, we said last week, was the earliest of the Gospels to be written. But Matthew is only writing while he is with Jesus himself. I noticed in The Chosen, I don't know if you're familiar with that, the series put out by Dallas Jenkins, very good, by the way. He's got Matthew recording by note-taking a lot of things that Jesus said in the series. I think that's very plausible. More than likely, that's how it happened. Matthew is the longest of the Gospels, 28 chapters, and I had an original thought. We know that Matthew, his Gospel is being written to the Jew. And could it be that Matthew is really trying to reach the Jew because he was rejected by his own kinsmen, because he was a tax collector? He was an employee of Rome, and the Jews hated him and other tax collectors because he had to take money from them for the various things that were being taxed. So with that in mind, perhaps Matthew really has a heart to try to reach the Jew. Some of the things about his gospel that are not in the others. He quotes more of the Old Testament, I believe I got 92 times here, than Mark, Luke, or John. He also uses what we call Hebraisms, or Jewish Hebrew idioms. One of them being Corban. You won't find that in the other Gospels. He is into the ancestry of Jesus from the Jewish perspective. He's trying to reveal to the Jews who their Messiah is. And there's a lot of doctrine in his Gospel teaching, many parables, more than the other Gospels, and also prophecies about Jesus being the Messiah who was to come. So that is a summary of Matthew's gospel. Even though they see together, synoptic, all three of them have original material. A lot of it overlaps, especially Matthew and Mark, but there's a lot of original material in each of the four gospels, especially John, which we'll get to in a few minutes. Now, Mark, I talked a little bit about Peter last week. The real author of Mark is Peter. He was obviously one of the 12, an eyewitness to the 3.5 years of Jesus' ministry, where Mark was not. The only reference that could be alluded to Mark is in 14th chapter of Mark, where it talks about a young man coming out to warn Jesus of the impending capture by the Jews and the Romans that were there at the time. He comes out to warn him. And it says he was wearing nothing but a linen sheet, woke up in the middle of the night, found out about this, comes running out to try to save Jesus, Some soldiers grab him, they take the linen cloth off him, he escapes naked into the night. We said that was Mark's way of saying, I was there. You won't find that in any of the other three Gospels. But Peter is the one, as I mentioned last week, who kind of takes Mark on, probably at the death of Barnabas, and begins to invest in him, deposit in him, and begins to share all the accounts, the history, the testimonies, the words of Jesus to this young man. Mark, probably at the time when he came out to warn Jesus, a teenager, maybe a little bit older, when he wrote his gospel. It's the earliest gospel written. The key word here that you find over and over in Mark is immediately. Immediately we went here or there or did this or that. And that really is descriptive of Peter, who was a man of action. He was a guy who, was ready to fight at the drop of a hat in the Garden of Gethsemane, chops the ear of the high priest's slave off. And, that's the way Peter is. He's just a rough and tumble kind of a guy. And he's sharing all this information with Mark later on. Mark being written, by the way, to the Romans. And a lot of speculation, was Peter in Rome? Possibly. They say he died in Rome, was crucified there. That's according to tradition, not the scriptures themselves. But Peter, we know, orally passed down a lot of information to Mark. And it's a gospel for the coming of the Gentile. It's a precursor for the Gentiles who come into the church in the book of Acts, through Peter, first of all. And so he's sharing all this, and it also depicts the human side of Jesus. Mark talks about the emotions of Jesus. He sighed at some people's unbelief, things like that. And the last thing I want to say about Mark, also being the shortest of the Gospels, Mark himself, after, things escalated with the church growth and all this, he goes down to Alexandria in Egypt, and they said he founded a church there and was also martyred there as well. So Mark, is kind of like the original gospel, and the others are taking from it some of it. Like I said, there's original material in the others as well, but Mark is the oldest and but also the shortest gospel as well. Now we get to Luke, and here is the only non-Jewish writer of the scriptures in the New Testament. Luke, we know, was a physician. He was well educated. He was a historian, a researcher. He did his homework. We see this in his gospel and also in the book of Acts. He writes about the births of John the Baptist and Mary, who has Jesus, Elizabeth being the mother of John the Baptist, Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now, how would he have information like that? He's not even brought into the scriptures until Acts chapter 16. I think it's on the second missionary journey of Paul. Well, there's some speculation here, which again I feel is very plausible. Luke, and again, Acts 16, it goes from they, Paul and Silas, to we. So we know Luke, the author, comes alongside of Paul and Barnabas at that time. Mary, Elizabeth, years before. How did he get the information? I heard this in Bible school, and I've also heard it a few times through the years. Probably Paul introduced Luke to Mary on one of his trips into Jerusalem. Because think about it. I mean, even the Song of Mary, I think they call it the Magnificat, how could that have been recorded? That had to be orally translated to somebody. And, a lot of people want to say, well, it's the Holy Spirit. And yeah, I could make an argument for that, but I think there's a human element in here as well. And Mary shares all these things, the history, the births of the Baptist and Jesus, to Luke, and he's recording all these things. And he knows things that the others don't write about. And then another possible source in Acts chapter 21, verse 16. Again, I think it might be the second or third missionary journey, I'm not sure which, but they go to the home of what Luke calls an early disciple by the name of Nason, Mnason. Now, to me, an early disciple, he wasn't one of the 12, we know that, but he might have been and probably was one of the 70 that Jesus sent out 2 by 2 in Luke chapter 10. So this man, and they stayed with him some days, probably began to tell Luke all the events such as Pentecost, the Spirit coming upon the believers in the upper room, and other things that he was there. Luke was not there, as far as we know. So he writes all these things down. And he's writing to Greeks who were more cerebral, very intellectual. They wanted proofs, these kinds of things. It says Jews sought for signs. Greeks were looking for more of an intellectual proof that Jesus was the Messiah. There's many references to the Holy Spirit in Luke, more so than the other Gospels, and a lot of references to women, such as already named Elizabeth, Mary, Mary and Martha. He talks about them, has them in his Gospel, others as well. And then in Acts with Priscilla, among others. So he is also stressing suffering, probably because he's a physician, and he's sharing a lot of material about human suffering from the perspective of being a doctor. So this is Luke's gospel of what he was recording here, and we also see now the Synoptics completed. They were all written around the same time. Again, there's debate about this. Mark, the earliest date was about 50 AD. Some people say the latter 50s. Matthew and Luke, probably around 58 AD or so. Now we've got John. Very much a different gospel than the other three. He's not included in what they call the Synoptics. A lot of original material. Why? Well, the date for his gospel is around 90 to 95 AD, some almost 60 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. So what does that tell you? A whole different generation of believers comes on the scene through the witness of the apostles and the early church. They don't know Jesus after the flesh. They probably don't know any of the apostles who were martyred by the 90s, except for John. And he has a whole different viewpoint in his gospel than the synoptic writers. He writes to everyone. John is called the universal gospel, not just to the Jew or to the Roman or to the Greek, everyone. And the thing with John is he stresses Jesus' relationship with people. You find the account of Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night, the woman at the well in chapter 4, various references to individual people, Lazarus in chapter 11, who dies and is raised from the dead. So John himself specifies that Jesus gave him the responsibility to care for Mary while the Lord is on the cross. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your woman. It says that Mary never really left Jerusalem. She lived with John. He had a home in Jerusalem, and he cared for her. The Gospel of John focuses not so much a lot on miracles as Mark does, the healings and deliverances in Mark. It focuses in on discourses or debates between Jesus and mainly the Pharisees. Why is that? Because this whole new generation of believers need to believe. They need to have their faith strengthened. And John's word here that he uses some 98 times in the gospel is believe. He's connecting Jesus with the Father. He is showing forth the great I ams. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the shepherd of the sheep. I am the gate that you enter through. Uh, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. All these things the newer generation of believers needed to know. Remember, there were no Bibles around, probably till in the 300s, where people compiled the scrolls and copied them into a book eventually that we call the Bible. So John's gospel, written on a scroll, had all this original material in it, and it's being circulated to newer believers that did not know Jesus after the flesh. So he outlives all the other apostles, John, probably into his 90s. And he is also a person who is a powerful expositor of the love of God. You see this especially in his epistles, 1 John in particular. We love God because he first loved us. This is the same guy, by the way, when he was a young man, that Jesus called, along with his brother James, sons of thunder. They were, not just energetic, they were very zealous, and they were, at one point they said, I think Jesus wanted to go through Samaria, and the Samaritans were opposing him, and they said, should we call fire down from heaven to consume them? They were sons of thunder, a lot of zeal, but not a lot of knowledge. John matures through the years. He becomes a seasoned saint. The love of God has so impressed upon him, changes him, and he's the author of a gospel that is very, very different than the other three, expounding on the love of God, the relationship of Jesus to the Father, and really revealing, showing forth the fact that he is the Messiah of the Jewish people and the whole world. So I wanted to share that with you, the Synoptics in contrast to the Gospel of John. Some of you may, already know these things if you've been in the faith for a long time. Others of you may not. And how do we apply this now? Remember last week I said I usually like to bring in some kind of an application. Well, here's a challenge for you. The summer, July, August, a few weeks into September, read through the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and come up with the original material that's in all of them. Write it down. You'll remember it that way. And see what overlaps, where some of the same things are in Matthew and in Mark. Just for one example, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle that's recorded in all four Gospels. So I think it might be a little challenging for you, and probably not just instructive, but inspirational as well. To get a summer into the Gospels, read them in context, and see the differences between the Synoptics and John. All right, so until next week, I will see you. Have a happy 4th of July.